Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh. Bismillah, alhamdulillah, wassalam, rasulullah. Today we're going to be talking about a lot, inshallah. So today we were talking about how what we will name this show, and maybe we'll change the name later on, but discussing probably the fitna of the lone sheep.
Yeah.
And so we're going to be talking about suicide. We're going to talk about, help with drug abuse, those who are incarcerated, those who are in prison, those who do wrong to themselves or do wrong to others, or they're entrapped, or they just caught up in the justice system. Unfortunately, they're locked up, and at times many people can be innocent. And how Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala still accepts the tawbah, the repentance, the turning back to Allah of His servants, and how us as a community can be there for them. So I'm joined with Graeth Bryant, alhamdulillah. Graeth Bryant received his CPE training at the College of Pastoral Service and Psychotherapy, and completed his chaplaincy residency at St. John's Episcopal Hospital. Chaplain Bryant has been working as a healthcare prison chaplain since 2016, working at Northwell, Lenox Hill, and Manhattan, NYU Langone, and Manola, Federal Defenders of New York, in both Manhattan and Brooklyn, working with Muslim inmates incarcerated via the BOP, the Federal Bureau of Prisons. Chaplain Bryant has counseled countless members of the Muslim community, specifically in terms of suicide, substance abuse, sexual abuse, crime and gang activity, domestic violence, end-of-life care, anti-terrorism, and marriage, divorce counseling. So with that, Graeth Bryant, tell us a little bit about what you do, and a little bit about who you are, and what is the daily outlook on your life look like when you go in and do your 9 to 5. What are some of the scenarios that you encounter?
Okay. Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullah.
Thanks.
My profession as a chaplain is hard work. It's hard work because it takes a lot of personal effort to be an empath, to be empathetic, to be a compassionate person, to care about other people. And I can say for myself, what drives me to be an empath, what drives me to be an empathetic person is the fact that Allah is ar-Ra'uf. Allah is the ultimately empathetic. Allah is the ultimate empath. Allah is the ultimately compassionate. And because Allah is Rabbul Alameen, because Allah is the caretaker of the universe, even that word Rabb comes from the Arabic verb Rabba, which means to care. And that's where the word tarbiyah, cultivation, comes from. Because when you cultivate someone, you're invested in the well-being of that person or that thing or that entity that you are working with. So for us as Muslims, we have an obligation to Allah to always be in the service of a tarbiyah, of cultivation, of caring and pouring from ourselves into others. And that's very challenging because, unfortunately, we live in a very apathetic world. We live in a very careless world. And I tell people all the time, apathy is worse than ignorance. Not caring is worse than not knowing. We engage people, or we walk past people all the time, and they may have problems that we know or don't know about, and we don't care. We just go around living our best lives, and we just go through our daily routines. It takes a special type of person to really stop and look at another person's condition and say, and ask Allah, how can I help this person? What would you want me to do to help this person? Empower me to help another person. It takes a lot of humility. It takes a lot of strength. It takes a lot of endurance. And most of all, it takes empathy to even have that type of mindset, that type of mentality, to be forthright, to be on that path of helping other people. You don't have to be a chaplain to be empathetic. You don't have to be a chaplain to help people. But it's just that my profession as a chaplain is comprised of 90% empathy and 10% listening skills. So if you don't care about people, it's a waste of time. It's morally unintelligent to be a chaplain if you don't care about people. So that's why my job is so challenging, because of the world is so empathetic, people are so solitary and isolated doing their own things. Too many people don't make the time or take the time or find the time to care about the condition of the other. But that's the responsibility of the Muslim. And I tell people all the time, when I function as a chaplain, I literally get paid to be Muslim. Because all of the things that I do as a chaplain, these are things that every Muslim is individually and communally obligated to do anyway. And just like when the Prophet, peace on him, Muhammad, peace on him, he mentioned, there are 4 types of people whom Allah has made hell prohibited from capturing and consuming. And those 4 categories of people are the following: those who are empathetic and kind to other people, those who are gentle to other people, those who are lenient and patient with other people, those who make themselves accessible, and those who are philanthropic, those who are generous with other people, those who are easygoing, those who go out of their way to make the lives of others easy. Literally all 4 of these things that Muhammad, peace be upon him, mentioned, that Allah has made hell prohibited from consuming a person, a Muslim who embodies those 4 things. Those 4 things are literally things that I'm professionally mandated to do as a chaplain anyway. So this is why I say that I'm getting paid. I literally get paid to be Muslim. And every time Allah allows me to go to work, I'm able to make the life of at least one person better. I tell people all the time, I can literally see myself being a chaplain until the day I drop dead. I can literally see myself dying on my way to work being a chaplain. Because that's how important that field is for me. That's how fulfilling that is to my life.
So with that said, because a couple of things that I want to talk about, like, what are some of the stories? What are some of the situations? Because sometimes people, they don't realize it until they hear something about someone else that they went through, traumatic. Then they realize, you know what? I need to step up. I need to step my game up. I need to be there for people. And we'll get into that, but you remind me of several things that I want to touch upon from our beloved tradition, in which Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala says, Irham man fil ardi yarhamkum fis sama. Hadith Qudsi, Allah says, if you have, Prophet said that if you have mercy on the earth, Allah will have mercy on you. And also, the fact that the Prophet said that to help a Muslim brother with his need is more beloved than breaking itikaf in my masjid, sleeping and praying all night in my masjid Nabawi.
Right.
It's more rewarded to help someone in need. SubhanAllah. And and then the last thing that I'll mention, we'll talk about certain stories of individuals that you may have helped before. Because sometimes the community is ignorant. And if they know, like, I agree with, like, knowing and not doing nothing is worse than not knowing. If you know, then you should do something, right? And we know the Prophet said, if you see an evil, you change it with your hands.
Right.
If you can't, then you speak about it. And if you can't, then you hate it in your heart. That's the worst. Is the last hadith that I'll mention is the Prophet he mentioned that Allah will say on the Day of Judgment, I was hungry and you didn't feed me. How? You're Allah, you're Rabbil Alameen, you're the master, creator, sustainer of the universe. How can I feed you? Didn't so-and-so ask you for food, and had you fed him, you would have found me with you. And the list goes on. Like, there was people in need, and you weren't there for them. You would have found Allah with you. So Allah, is this the drive that you have to do what you do? And then what are some of the stories of people that went through? Because sometimes people, until they get a story, then they wake up, right?
Yeah.
Unfortunately, until like after the fact, I think it was during the during the Great Depression. It wasn't until the president saw a depiction, somebody of his complexion, unfortunately, but anybody in poverty, doesn't matter who they are, he saw somebody in a depiction of them in deep poverty with their children, an old lady in poverty, until he saw that photograph before videos, and until he saw that photograph and he saw the deep poverty of those in the Great Depression, then he took some distinctive action. So until we hear those stories, I think Gareth, we need to wake up.
It has to be conveyed in a way that it makes it real for people. Like what you mentioned, like there's another narration which Muhammad, he mentioned, he said, Allah will speak to a person and he will say to them, "Oh, my servant, I was once ill, but you never visited me." Person's going to be shocked when they hear this. Then they're going to say, "Oh Allah, you're the Lord of the universe. How is it even possible for you to be ill that I should visit you?" And he will say, "Weren't you aware that one of my other servants was ill and you didn't visit them?" And then Allah will say to the person, "Were you also unaware that if you would have visited that person, you would have found me with him?" Meaning the mercy of Allah, the forgiveness of Allah, the pardon of Allah. And there's another narration which Muhammad, he mentioned, he said, those who visit the ill, they are in a fruit garden of paradise until they leave the person that they're visiting.
And the angels, 70,000 angels are making dua for you.
Yes. Yeah. So, and we have to remember something. Visiting a person who's ill is not necessarily just confined to a person who's in a hospital bed or in a jail cell or a prison cell. We all have diseases, right? So let's say, for example, just if you engage a person, because we all suffer from some type of spiritual flaw, psycho-emotional flaw, primal flaw, physical flaw, whatever. If you're engaging with that person, that counts as visitation. That counts as a ziyarah. Just by you being that concerned to see about someone, to check in with someone, to have a conversation. Like, for example, people who are suicidal. The average person who's suicidal, they make a suicide attempt or they commit suicide because they really think and feel that no one cares about them. When
Have you experienced people who committed suicide?
By Allah's mercy, I've literally have prevented people from attempting suicide in front of me. I've literally had to restrain people from attempting suicide.
Physically?
Physically, yes. Yes.
Wow. Wow. What was going on through their mind? What actions were they trying to take?
When a person attempts suicide, when a person is suicidal in general, even before the suicide attempt, when a person is suicidal, when a person contemplates atahlaka, harm, suicide, they don't actually want to die. They want their suffering to die. It's just that for whatever reason, they allow a shaitan, Satan, to convince them that the only way to end them, to end their suffering is to end themselves. Like, for example, there's a narration in it's authored, I mean, it's recorded by Al-Bukhari in his Sahih and Kitab al-Iman, the chapter of Iman, the chapter of faith. And the narrator, At-Tufail ibn Amr al-Dawsi, he speaks about one of his fellow tribesmen who became Muslim around the time of the second hijrah, the second migration. And this is when the Muslims were migrating from Mecca to Yathrib. And during that time period, At-Tufail asked Muhammad, peace be upon him, he said, allow us to arm the people so that they can fight against the Quraysh. And this was before Allah had mandated al-qital.
Gareth was just sharing a story with us.
Yeah, I was mentioning the story of At-Tufail ibn Amr al-Dawsi, may Allah be pleased with him. He was one of the companions. And he had assisted Muhammad, peace be upon him, along with his tribesmen, who's the subject of this narration, who's unnamed in the narration. This was during the time of the second hijrah, the second migration, the second escape. As we know, the first escape was from Mecca to Abyssinia. The second migration, the second escape was from Mecca to Yathrib. So these companions were helping Muhammad, peace be upon him, help people escape from Mecca to Yathrib. During this time period, the companion of Tufail ibn Amr al-Dawsi, he had asked the Prophet to arm the people so that they can commit armed resistance against the Quraysh for oppressing them. And this was prior to Allah sending down the faridah, the mandate for al-qital, combat. So because this was prior to that, Muhammad said, no, we're not going to do this. So then he asked him, can we at least help you smuggle people out of Mecca to Yathrib? And he agreed to this. So At-Tufail and another companion, again, this unnamed companion is the subject of the narration. They were assisting the Muslims escape from Mecca to Yathrib. So when the Muslims got to Yathrib and established Al-Madinah, the unnamed person in the narration, he started to become very ill because the climate dynamics in Al-Madinah was different from Mecca. And he had gotten so ill that he became bedridden. And because he got bedridden, he became very sad and he became what would now be classified as clinical depression, right? So a shaitan, Satan, he came to him and he negatively inspired this person to do a tahlaka, self-harm. And this is why Allah says in the Quran, in chapter 2, verse 195, Allah says, and don't be led to destruction via your own hands. So a shaitan had inspired this person to commit a tahlaka against themselves, harm against themselves, destruction against themselves, self-destruction. So the narration is very descriptive. So the narration mentions that this man was like consistently cutting his hands.
And he was trying to get the pain away.
He was trying to get some type of relief. So this is why I mentioned, it segues back into what I mentioned about suicide, is that self-harm, is that when people are suicidal or driven to self-harm, they don't actually want to die. They want their suffering to die. So they allow a shaitan to convince them that the only way to end the suffering is to harm themselves. So this person, this unnamed companion, was cutting their hands. It actually mentioned in the narration that they did this so much that they end up bleeding to death. So after the janazah of the person, the At-Tufail ibn Amr al-Dawsi saw this person in a dream. And he saw the person with their hands bounded as though they were recovering from like wounds or burn wounds, what have you. And he asked the person, he said, how did Allah treat you? Like, what did your Lord deal with you after you did what you did to yourself? And in the dream, the other companion told At-Tufail, He said, because of my service to the Prophet, Allah chose to forgive me, but chose to not forgive my hands. Immediately, he ran to Muhammad ﷺ and told him the dream. And after he told him the dream, after At-Tufail ibn Amr al-Dawsi told him the dream, Muhammad made dua. He made prayer for this person. He said, may Allah even forgive his hands. Right? So this is also important also because, unfortunately, we have Muslims who think and feel that if a Muslim dies via suicide or suicide-related cause, that they don't have janazah rights. This is not true.
I think they're thinking of the narration when the person in the battlefield, he suffered a lot of wounds, that he just did it
out of desperation. Right.
That Allah didn't forgive that. He
took
a direct action to harm himself.
Right.
But this was like he was going through pain. He was trying to get rid of the pain. He's trying to do some kind of surgery on himself.
Well, this is why the scholars, they differ in terms of a person's status who commits suicide. The most correct opinion is that if a person was known to be a Muslim, in spite of them killing themselves, if they were known to be a Muslim, you are to still make janazah for them. And there's other narrations in which a companion had killed themselves, and Muhammad, peace be upon him, said, pray over your brother, but I will not pray over the person. But he gave the other companions
that behavior.
Right. Yeah, exactly. He didn't want to co-sign it, but at the same time, he didn't deny the person their janazah rights. So this is why there's an ikhtilaf among ulama, amongst religious scholars about this issue.
And if you don't mind, can we go into like, what are the stories of the people I hear? And of course, this is a beautiful profession. We respect people's confidentiality. But some of these stories might help you. I don't know. Is it good talking about these stories?
No. It's necessary to have people aware. I'll give you an example.
We don't want is the lone sheep, right? If someone is going through an issue, they should reach out to somebody like you.
But the reason why we have lone sheep is because there are not enough people directly and indirectly advocating for someone. Like, with Allah's help, someone watching this video will be empowered because they'll be like, oh wow, someone really does care. Someone is really speaking my language. Someone is really in tune with what I go through. Like, and this is the thing about empathy, right? There's a difference between empathy and sympathy. Sympathy means that you have compassion for another person because of a shared experience. Let's say, for example, you got into a car accident, I got into a car accident. It's not going to be the same because we're different people, it affects us differently. But at least I'm like, okay, I care about what you're going through because I went through the same thing. Empathy means that you care about someone, you have compassion for someone, regardless of whether you have a shared experience with that person, right? Let's say, for example,
what are some real
I'm gonna give you an example, right? I remember working in a hospital one day, right? And I was counseling a person, I was visiting a person who was terminally ill, and they were with their spouse. And I'm chopping it up, kicking it with the guy. And because of the engagement, his wife felt, I mean, obviously they had, in hindsight, you'll see, obviously they had a great level of respect and trust for me. So much so that during the engagement, the wife chimes into the discussion and she immediately discusses how she was suffering for 3 decades as a result of being a victim and casualty of sexual abuse, of al-ikhtisab. And this is all within a 30-minute conversation. Within 30 minutes, she's opened up. Yeah. She literally disclosed 30 years worth of trauma within a 30-minute conversation. And these are people that I never knew before and haven't seen since. And speaking of, like, we was about atahlaka, self-harm, suicide, based on my profession, at least 98% of people who I've counseled pertaining to 3 specific things. 98% of people who I've counseled pertaining to self-harm and suicide, sexual identity crisis, homosexuality, 98% of these people who I've counseled pertaining to those 3 things, they were victims and casualties of sexual abuse at least once during their lifetime. There's a very strong correlation between self-harm and suicide and sexual abuse.
So they were sexually abused at a young age?
Well, not necessarily at a young age, but at any age.
At an age in their life.
Any age, yeah.
And then that translated most of the time, not all the time, to them causing harm.
Yeah.
Either to themselves or to others.
Yeah. So not that it's a definitive cause, but it's correlation.
There's a correlation.
It's a correlation. And the correlations are undeniable.
What are some of the solutions? What can people do? Right? If somebody is a victim of abuse, right? Legitimately, right? Not these false claims and slanders and
since you mentioned that, it's a known fact that at least 98% of sexual abuse claims are accurate. at least 98% of people who commit only two. Yeah. These are just historical and statistical stats. Only 2% of people who make sexual abuse allegations are people who are lying. 98% are telling the absolute truth.
I mean, I don't deny that at all. Being that you have to.
I mean, we know people who do lie about these type of things. We know that, right? Yeah.
There's got to be a level of. There's got to be a level of just like.
It has to be objectivity.
With a level of I'm talking about the victim.
Right. Yeah.
That level of vulnerability to open up and say that. Like,
yeah.
You gotta lie about something like that. But at the same time, I think some people are a little skeptical when it comes to like, you know, like a humongous name in the news, and then there's like a bandwave of allegations, and Allahu Alam, you know, is it
like the whole concept of the Me Too movement.
Yeah,
that's a good example.
There's a lot of money that came out of that.
Right? Yeah, of course. Yeah.
Cases, that.
But see, and that's when the lines are very blurred. The lines are very blurred in that regard, because especially for a person like me, in my standing as a professional, as a chaplain, you always have to be objective, because it's impossible to be just with people if you're not objective. Yes. And this is why Allah is Al-Muqsit, the ultimately just. Because Allah is always objective at all times. Obviously, by virtue of the fact that Allah is Al-Alim, that Allah knows everything, that we can't hide anything from Allah. Obviously, that's the reason how and why Allah is always objective at all times. And that's the reason why Allah is just at all times. Because Allah sees everything. Allah knows everything. Allah hears everything. Allah overwatches everything. Allah is aware of everything.
And may Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, alleviate the pain and suffering for those who go through that.
Ameen.
No way are we advocating for anything but, as you said,
justice. Yeah.
Justice, compassion, and mercy to those who dealt with anything like that. And so, what are some of the solutions, right? If somebody is
conversations like
abuse,
this,
suicide, they're getting locked up, entrapment happens. I mean, those are all different issues, but let's start with the suicide, the drug abuse. What can someone do if they need help, or if they know someone that needs help?
Caring is always the most fundamental thing. Caring
for themselves first, right?
Yeah, but no, that's on the personal end. But I'm talking about from the outside looking in. From the outside looking in, the best thing that we can do is definitively let people know that we care. Like, we got to look in the camera and say, "I care about you." We have to let people know that. Like, whether you know me or whether you don't, you have to know that I genuinely care. Whether I ever meet you in person or whether I don't, whether I've ever counseled you or not, whether I know your story or not, I legitimately care. This is what we have to tell the people. They have to know this. They have to feel this. They have to really know for sure that we, persons like you and I, our work, they have to know that we actually care. Not just in word, but in action.
Because they feel like no one does.
Yeah. And that's why people are so secluded with their struggles, rightfully so. Because like you said, it takes a lot of courage to, but it's fearful. And like I tell people all the time, courage is not the absence of fear. It's the willingness and ability to confront fear. But you have to have support to confront those type of fears.
And sometimes, we're talking about people that deal with this physical abuse, and then sexual abuse.
Right, just abuse holistically, right.
They end up repeating the same actions that they probably were victim of.
No, it's true. Like that cliche statement, hurt people. It's very cliche, but there's a lot of truth and honesty in that. I'll give an example, right? One of my clients who I did work on the Federal Bureau of Prisons, I worked on their case. I was doing counseling work on behalf of the legal team that represented the person. I was counseling them. I was acting in a role as a Muslim chaplain. And this was very difficult to deal with. And like, for example, I don't know whether you heard about the movie Sound of Freedom. It's a movie about human trafficking. That movie was very difficult to watch because literally everything in that movie, I've literally had to deal with and confront from a professional perspective. And because I've counseled people who were victims and casualties of human trafficking, sex trafficking. I've literally counseled people who were human traffickers and sex traffickers. And that's why like people like doing time locked up for that. Which brings me to I was counseling a Muslim who I literally knew personally. I know this person on a first name basis. They know me on a first name basis. I've known this person for years. His family knows me first name basis. In fact, his family, his relatives, his loved ones literally reached out to me through the they reached out to me personally, and they reached out to me through the legal team that represented their Muslim client because they knew I was the only person who would take on their case. That's why they reached out to me. And it was very difficult for me to deal with this person knowing that they tried to lure young people to sexually abuse them. Like, I literally wanted to kill this person. I wanted to hurt this person really badly, but I knew that that wasn't the solution. But that's what I thought. That's what I felt. I was so angry. I was so triggered. Even though by Allah's mercy, the person was caught before they were able to fulfill what they planned out to do. In spite of that, but just the details that they had disclosed, it made me want to do time for hurting that person to the utmost, like seriously. And it took a lot out of me to still have empathy for that type of person and those like them. Because even people who do those things, even a tyrant deserves justice. We know this from Islam. Like, no one deserves to be oppressed, not even an oppressor, right? Like, for example,
I love the saying of the Osman Turkish show, right?
Right.
He goes, you know, mercy to the oppressors is injustice to the oppressed. You know, so sometimes we have.
I mean, it depends on what angle you're coming from, because again, like for example, what Allah says, right? When Allah says in chapter 5, verse 8, Allah says, "And never let your hatred against any people prevent you from behaving justly." This is why, let's say, for example, if someone has to receive a had, if someone has to receive an Islamic punishment for a crime, you don't exceed the bounds of that. So even if someone has to be punished for a crime, you don't, like, because in Islam we can't torture a person.
And some people take these things into revenge. It's like,
right. There's a difference between justice and vengeance. Yes. There's a difference between justice and revenge. It's not about revenge. Vengeance and revenge are for Allah alone. Only Allah has the right to be vengeful and revengeful. No. We have to be just. Because you know why? Because it's impossible for us to be just when we're seeking vengeance and revenge. It's impossible. Only Allah will be just when he enacts revenge and vengeance. Only Allah has that capability to be just while seeking vengeance and revenge. Only Allah is capable of being just even in that. We do not have the capacity. We don't have the capability of being just while pursuing vengeance and revenge.
Day and age here,
especially in our times.
Yeah, we're not the managers of the disposal of the affairs of the people right now. Like we don't have the political might or power.
Right. We don't have the wilaya. We don't have the authority. Right.
The authority to implement that. But it is good to know that we're coming to the end of this episode, and I want to end off with saying that, you know, we discussed some of these people that go through these issues, right? And I think what happens is when they go through this abuse, is that they believe that because they went through this traumatic experience,
they feel that Allah has abandoned them.
That not only that, they also feel that this is their worldview.
This is all they know, and they become comfortable with that. They become addicted to that.
And until they hear from somebody like, "We care for you,
right?
We understand for you," then they can get out of the cycle of repeating that which they were a victim of.
Right. And which brings me back to the person that I was counseling who was trying to human traffic and sex traffic and all of that. And I asked them, I said, "Why didn't you come to someone?" Because the person knew I was a chaplain. Like I said, the person knew me for years. And I asked them, I was like, "Yo, why didn't you come to me before this happened? Why didn't you come to me?" Because the person mentioned that they were sexually abused as well. Yeah, towards people who do this. And you can't blame people. You can't fault people for judging someone who does these heinous things. At the same time, this is what Muhammad Peace mentioned.
Don't judge a victim.
No, it's not.
No.
I'm talking about even a person who's an oppressor, right? But like, for example, when Muhammad Peace mentioned, aid your brother, regardless of whether they're the oppressed or the oppressor, right? And the companion said, "Wait a minute, we know how to help a person who's oppressed. How do we help the oppressor?" He said, "Grab him." He said, "Seize his hand," meaning stop the oppression, meaning prevent it, meaning put mechanisms in place so they won't be able to oppress. And we as Muslims specifically, unfortunately, we don't champion putting those mechanisms in place. And we've failed ourselves and we failed each other in that regard. So conversations like this, platforms like this, with Allah's help, it will empower us to go forward with establishing these parameters, these hudud.
All these different instances. And the last one that I'll mention with regards to the shaitan, not even regards to the shaitan, this dua is so beautiful because it's constantly calling out to Allah, which is Rabbi a'udhu bika min hamazati shayateen. Rabbi, my cherisher, my Lord, my Savior, I seek refuge in you from the grief, the depression of the shayateen, of the devils.
From the misery of the devils, right.
Rabbi a'udhu bika an yahdurun. You calling out Allah again. Rabbi a'udhu bika an yahdurun. I seek refuge that they're even present.
We're reminding people to call upon Allah for everything we need.
help others.
Right, exactly. All of so this conversation, this convo is an act of ibadah by default, right? And even in making dua, making prayer, right? One of the things that Muhammad, he mentioned, he told people to raise our hands when we make dua, because Allah is shy about any of his servants who raises their hands and ask Allah for something and to leave them empty-handed.
Thank you. Tune into iTVusa, the Roku channel, 37 networks. This is a collaboration podcast with A Brighter Ummah. My brother Majed Behaibih Graeth Bryant. Thank you all for joining in. Thank you, and assalamu alaikum.
Wa alaikum salam.